Good morning, everyone. We set to start on a very interesting session. We will focus on data and research to understand how to make transformative change in the transport sector. It's 2021, and the rapid growth in urbanization challenges our ability to reach the 2030 SDG targets for reducing mortality on the road, for providing sustainable access to transport and public transport to all, including vulnerable groups such as women, children, persons with disabilities, and even the elderly. And we must do this in a context in which transport is one of the main sources of carbon emissions. And thus, this is a sector that is our priority for a green revolution. Now, to do that, we may have to make much greater levels of global commitments and reach much higher levels of coordinations across our policies, from regulation to price incentives to incentivize zero net emissions in this sector. Now, the issue, of course, is that we don't necessarily know how. Infrastructure investments today will set the course of countries' carbon footprints and their climate vulnerability. And kind of the optimal investment approaches that we should follow are often far from clear. Should, for example, in a country like Indonesia, invest in a flood wall to protect Jakarta, or implement land zoning regulation and support the reallocation from those dangerous zones? How do we make that decision? Building climate resilient infrastructure reduces our vulnerability to climate shocks, but by lowering these risks, we might also incentivize the wrong behaviors that then will lead to even more important problems in the future. And so I think of this session as an opportunity for us to how we are going to use technology and data and research to actually come up and understand our strategies moving forward and provide much greater grounding to our ability to weigh different options and make informed decisions in our large investments in climate-related resilience and infrastructure. In 2015, we launched a program called iConnect. This is a very ambitious program of impact evaluation research in transport across 30 different countries in all the regions of the world. And the program has been really an amazing ride for us into understanding the economic potential of transport infrastructure. And we have used innovation in data measurement, state-of-the-art experimentation on the ground, as well as economic analysis to come up with strategies that amplify the impact of transport infrastructure around the world. Really, it is a search and a journey into better understanding the nature of the problems that we face and devising strategies to prioritize investments where they are likely to be more effective or most effective, and help to reduce very complex problems of mobility, mortality, others into more manageable problems by the intensive use of data and really targeting our investments in a more effective fashion. During the crisis, the fact that we have built these high-frequency data systems in different cities or in different countries have allowed us the opportunity to provide governments with real-time feedback into what was happening during the crisis, how to manage the crisis, or how to shape response. In this panel, we will explore how innovation in technology, data, coupled with ways of analyzing the problems and testing solutions can help us progress much faster in making transport a driver for development. By testing new technologies, documenting impact, and securing financing for adoption of at-scale and effective solutions, we can find ways to meet many of the SDGs in record time and with limited resources, or so we hope so. We have an examples from Nairobi where we show that by developing real-time crash data, we can sorry, I had a little interruption there. But in Nairobi, we showed that high-frequency data on crashes can help us identify the 1% of the road network that is responsible for 50% of the death in the city. This is really an example of how you reduce the problem of managing mortality in a city down to a much smaller portion of the road network. So today, we'll debate on how data and data analytics and impact evaluation research can transform what we know and how we can complement investment in transport with a lot of knowledge that help us plan, respond, and really get more for our bucks. We have a distinguished panel that brings together decades of experience in thinking about transport policies and data. I will introduce you as I ask you questions. But I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from you, and as I know our audience is also doing so. And I would like to start our questions with Sarah Williams. Sarah Williams is an old friend and collaborator, and she is they're banging on my door. She is the MIT professor and the author of a new exciting book on data action, which focusing on how to use data as a tool for empowerment rather than oppression. And I'd like to ask Sarah to tell us more about that and give us some example of how we can use data really for empowering people and against oppression. Hello.
Hello. Sarah, I think you're mute.
We still can't hear you, Sarah.
Hi, can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, great. Not sure what the problem was there. Super excited to be here, and I know we have a long panel, so I'll just be very quick. There are so many ways that data can be used for empowerment. I think one way is really when communities collect the data themselves. So much of data right now is collected by governments or private organizations, and when communities can do their own data collection and tell the story from their own perspective, that really helps create a way to have a debate, to sit at the table with government officials and other stakeholders. I think a great example of that is often you see projects where communities collect air quality data, but also we've done a lot of work where people collect informal transit systems and really provide essential information about where the stops and routes on these systems exist, empowering the community to get around better in the city, but also by really showing that these systems provide an essential resource in their communities.
Thank you, Sarah. Perhaps you can give an example of where data has been used for oppressive purposes and how we can guard against that.
Wow, that's there are so many ways that data is used as evidence for oppression. And I think and I'm sure each one of you guys has a factor story that kind of is a clear example of that evidence. I think just even, though I just would like to say missing data is also a form of oppression as well, not being counted or not being part of the data set. And I would say even in most recent examples, many of the things that we've heard about COVID is an example of data not being counted, and therefore the needs of those populations not being taken into account. I would say even more so, so much of data is missing that it's hard to make decisions about essential things like transportation. And this gets back to the project that Arianna was talking about earlier. We don't have data on where traffic accidents are happening. That basic essential data is missing. And, much of the reason that accidents are happening are urban design problems or other things that could be solved by planning our cities in better ways. So, by creating those data sets, we are able to make better decisions and direct resources to that. So, for example, in that project, we found that there are many hotspot crashes, and those would direct people to develop the infrastructure in those areas. So I just want to highlight that missing data is as much of an oppression tool as having data itself.
I see Onkar is nodding. Onkar, Ambekar and Sanjay Ravi, they're industry leader in artificial intelligence and big data in the field of automotive. And they're contributors to a recent report on enabling data sharing, emerging principle for transforming urban mobility. So I'd like to take the questions to you, Onkar, first, and then Sanjay. What do you think is the role the technology companies play or can play in laying the groundwork for data sharing?
I think that's a great question, particularly what Sarah said. From the technology point of view, the companies, when we talk about data in terms of data storage, storing the data, is becoming at scale. It is now going to grow into petabytes, if not zettabytes. Then there is another layer added to it, which is processing the data, the capacity and capability. Addition to that would be the regulatory compliance, such as GDPR. Adding to that is data normalization, standardization, or harmonization, whatever you want to call it. Then the tools and technology that are relevant for data analytics, which brings value out of the data that we process. So there are, and on top of it, the consent management, user consent management, or customer consent management. These are the quite many number of tools and technologies that are very relevant for any kind of use case that you may have in terms of transportation or city logistics. So these are some of the things that technology companies can bring in to help deliver these value pools, if I may say so.
Perhaps, Sanjay, you can tell us kind of frame a little what Onkar said in a greater picture of how the digital transformation in the automotive industry has been shaped by this data revolution. We cannot hear you. I think you need to unmute.
About that. Hopefully you can hear me now. Thank you for having me here, and great conversation around the whole data and data sharing and the issues around it. You know, when we look at this from a broader industry perspective, there are three areas that we believe are very important. And the first one you already touched on in terms of having some very basic data sharing principles. And we are honored to partner with WBCSD as part of the Transportation and Transforming Urban Mobility project, where we are a co-lead and a contributor around the data and digitization work stream. Now, when you look at the data sharing principles, there are a number of areas that are important. The first one is we want to make sure that this is driving shared value across the ecosystem, so across the automotive ecosystem. But we also want to make sure privacy and cybersecurity is in there by design. And then finally, you know, to your discussion earlier, we want to make sure this is a very inclusive, ethical, and unbiased way for us to engage. And all the processes we put together are very adaptive and iterative. Now, on the technology front, as technology providers, you know, there are capabilities Microsoft and the rest of the technology ecosystem are putting together. On our end, we have brought in capabilities like Azure Data Store, the Azure Data Share, which is a way by which people can share data across organizations and easily control what you share and who receives the data, and also the terms of use. Multiple organizations are also coming together to support this. An example of that is the Open Data Initiative that we have with Adobe and SAP, where we can help organizations create really a data-powered digital feedback loop for greater business impact, while also helping them to enable security and privacy and compliance initiatives. And now in automotive, one great example I'd like to share with you is the work that is done by Mitsubishi Fuso Truck and Bus Corporation, where they're harnessing real-time telemetry data, and they're sharing that with customers to help them manage their fleets, both the uptime but also fuel efficiencies. And overall, these data sharing efforts drive significant value to the society at large by making transportation safer and also more environmentally friendly. So there are a number of these examples that we see, but like I mentioned earlier, the principles are important, the technology enablement is critical, and then, you know, this is available for the industry to use that across the number of fleets and support this new emerging smart mobility models.
I find that fascinating. And in fact, I'll pick up on one of the said on adaptive research. A lot of people still think of research as something that is, you know, far and detached from the day-to-day work. But in fact, you know, research has been transformed in real time and providing inputs into people's decisions really on a day-by-day basis. And this is so exciting for our ability to reach our objective in a much shorter period of time. And the other thing that you said is kind of sharing to improve the efficiency on the way we do things, and providing data to others for others to make decisions on their supply chains and their ability to manage fleets. This is really fascinating. I want to pass it to Verena Ehrler, who was the former head of the Department of Council of Transport at the German Institute of Transport. And I'd like to ask you, Verena, what is the role of electromobility for commercial transport? And how do we measure the impact of the carbon footprint? We are all walkers and bikers, but that will not be sufficient. We really have to move quickly into a different world, a world that does not take old cars, polluting cars to developing countries, but actually develops electromobility for all in an efficient fashion. Can you tell us your view on how do we get there?
Yeah, thank you, Arianna. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for this interesting question. I think it starts with when you just said, how do we not transfer what's not working where we live to other countries which are just developing industrialization. I think what I thought when I listened to my fellow speakers so far, I thought it's perhaps important not to just send what we don't want anymore for them to use. So when we are developing electromobility for transport, we are currently trying to implement it, or there are strong efforts. I live in Europe, so in Europe, strong efforts, but not only here, to introduce electromobility for both passenger transport and freight transport. And I think what we have seen in this development already is that there's still often a thinking in two very different categories: passenger transport and freight transport. But these chains, from my perspective, are merging. When it comes COVID, we are all suffering from the consequences of the pandemic. So I guess everybody around this table knows they will have ordered more online than prior to confinement, or however you live, which shows that transport chains for goods don't end in shops anymore, but they really end at the door of the end user. So, and that relates to how we use data and how we can make best use of data. It shows that you need transparency on flows of goods and on movements of people in order to develop efficient transport systems. So we need to think more in systems and less in this system of transport of passenger and goods, and connecting people with goods. And the other point related to that is we need to think of efficiency and not necessarily of faster and faster. So electromobility is definitely one point to eliminate. To come to this part of your question, you can reduce for sure local emissions. If we introduce it, we again should use the data we have access to make sure it's not only reducing local emissions, but emissions over the entire transport system.
Very, very well said, Verena. We have one of our participants asking about regional road safety observatories and sharing their experience in collecting data on crashes and also on performance indicators. So I'd like to actually pass it to Paul St-Aubin on that note. He's a transport engineer and senior product manager for Transport Solutions, Transportation Safety Division. You have been working to develop tools that allow for collision detection and specifically the use of video to measure near misses. Can you tell us how can we enhance vulnerable road user safety in developing countries using AI-based proactive decision-making tools? That's a mouthful, but I'm sure you'll make it, you'll clarify for the audience what all of that means. Paul,
Sure.
to you.
Thanks, Arianna. So not only rate fatality is the top 10 cause of death in the world globally, but we know that in developing countries...
Can you speak a little louder? We cannot hear you very well.
So not only are road fatalities a top 10 cause of death in the world globally, we know that developing countries are disproportionately affected by road user fatalities and safety issues. And this is especially true for vulnerable road users. So at Transoft, we started working with road safety engineers in some developing countries. They tell us that they are very eager to get access to this data, but because their number one challenge is a lack of historical crash data. So with video-based surrogate safety analysis, we're able to create that data or gather that data using video cameras. Surrogate safety analysis was originally conceived because the limitations of crash data that is collected, there's some challenges with it. But if the data doesn't exist, that's all the more reason to turn towards these technologies. So this technology allows us to take, maybe 10 or 5 year of data collection, which you normally need for a successful road safety study, and you can compress it down into months or weeks. And that's a huge advantage when you're starting out with absolutely no crash data to begin with. So we understand, even if we had crash data today, the methods have some challenges that still need to be addressed. We want to take that lesson and apply it from the start in countries with emerging road safety programs. So the technology we're developing at Transoft is infrastructure-based. That means it can be obtained, deployed, operated, and maintained by transportation authorities directly. This is a great news for governments, government and community investment initiatives. So contrast that to safety initiatives that are driven by the consumer market instead, where people are required to purchase smart wearable technology or smart car technology. So this is definitely technology that is accessible when the initiative starts from the government or from the community itself. And finally, I wanted to dispel the myth that AI is artificial intelligence technology is really out of reach for developing countries. Yes, it's true. There's a lot of high-tech algorithms that go in it, but some of the biggest costs for this technology is actually not the algorithm development. A lot of those have been developed. Some of the biggest costs are just to train the AI to teach. We literally need just teachers to teach the AI how to work, and especially how to be adapted to the local environment. So this is an activity that's well within the reach of an unskilled labor market, or one that hasn't had years and years of university education.
I am not going to let you off that easily. So our experience working with technology companies is that the technology is generally developed for developed countries, and kind of adapting the technology to local conditions in low capacity environments and cities that may not have been the result of detailed planning are quite challenging. Different levels of literacy, different levels of capacity. Can you tell us a bit about your experience working with us in Ethiopia and what you have learned as a result of that? What are some of the fundamental things that we should be aware of when we start off introducing, really high-tech technology in cities and metropolis in the developing world?
Yeah, for sure. So thinking of that project specifically, we did run into a couple challenges. One, one was very basic. It was just a lack of aerial image data. We need to gather, or we need aerial images of the sites to collect information in order to calibrate our cameras and to understand what the sites themselves look like. From a ground up view, and sometimes those images just aren't available, especially the high resolution ones. So in this respect, we're looking at drone technology to be able to solve those problems. You can quickly fly up and gather some screenshots of the area. But even if that's not an option, we're also looking at more sophistication in the algorithms to be able to solve those technical problems. I think you sort of alluded to it. The other problem was again, when we have different traffic compositions in developing countries, or at least compared to our experience in North America. The behavior is different, and the density and the composition creates additional challenges that we're not traditionally used to facing. Again, we can leverage the local workforce to help train the AI algorithms to accelerate the technology to be able to work with the local site conditions. So I think that's going to be very important there. And we've, on our end, worked hard to adapt some of these technologies to large traffic streams. This is definitely a huge area of importance for us in that respect.
I hear you correctly, Paul. Working in more challenging environments, we need to be even more savvy from a technological point of view and actually get even more technological. That's fascinating. Robin, I'm coming to you. Robin is the Director of Knowledge Capture and Collaboration at WRI, Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. And now I'm gonna throw you into Latin America, and specifically in one of the largest cities in the world, Mexico City, where apparently you find in your study, maybe not surprisingly, but that someone living in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods has 28 times better job access and 113 times better access to public hospital beds. This is not necessarily, a surprise. What we want to know from you is, how do you see these type of statistics shaping our understanding and shaping action? How do we make use of this data and visualization of these data to make people more aware of what needs to be done? Tell us more about that.
Muted. Robin, you're muted.
Hear you. So while you figure out your audio, Robin, I'm going to pass it to Bilal, who was still listening to you. But Bilal is old friend and director of research at UC Berkeley, Center for Effective Global Action, CEGA. So we have worked together for a long time, and specifically you've been leading and working on a case of the iConnect portfolio in Dar es Salaam, thinking about how to evaluate the first fast rapid transport investment in Africa. How did you approach the problem of evaluating the placement of large infrastructure in the city on poverty reduction, labor market linkages in these fairly difficult contexts?
Thank you,
perhaps
Arianna.
you can link up to some of the answers we have received today on data uses and how we think about that.
Absolutely. No, thank you firstly for inviting me to participate in this extremely high-powered and exciting panel. I'm really happy to also have the opportunity to talk about this project. As you know, I take every opportunity to do that. So yes, as you mentioned, we partnered with the government to understand the impacts of the first bus rapid transit system in sub-Saharan Africa. And two of the key things we wanted to understand were the impacts on jobs and on income in general. We had obviously other things that we were also interested in learning about, which we can talk about maybe later if there's time. But on poverty reduction and on labor market linkages, the idea was quite simple. A shorter and a cheaper commute will make it easier for people who don't have jobs to go and find jobs, to commute downtown and do basically look for jobs. But also for firms to find workers that are better able to match them. So even if people have jobs, they may be poorly matched to firms. High-skilled workers may not have the access to firms that require high-skilled jobs, and therefore may be actually taking low-skilled jobs, and vice versa. And for households to access markets other than the labor market, simply to get their groceries or to take their children to school or to access health clinics. So accessing markets and services across the city. So we thought these were essentially ways in which labor markets could change and people's incomes and welfare and amenities could improve. But there's a basic issue when you're looking at an urban transport infrastructure investment, which is that as commuting becomes easier, people move, right? Some people will move closer to the commuting options. Others will take the opportunity to move out of the city. And as we all know, we are remote working and telecommuting, and our residential choices about where to live have completely changed over this last year. Now, the problem, or not really a problem, is that when people move, prices will change, right? So some neighborhoods will become very desirable. Maybe there's the neighborhoods outside the city. Maybe there are the neighborhoods where there is a new BRT station. And as a result, rents and other prices will move in order to accommodate this. So this might mean that, for example, some neighborhoods become quite attractive, and that means that those people who live in those neighborhoods can no longer afford to live there. And we know this phenomenon as gentrification. And so when we were starting to think about this project, we realized a couple of things. Firstly, that improved commuting through this kind of infrastructure investment will have high and hard to predict spatial spillovers, meaning it will impact people both near and far from the investment, and will really change the dynamics of the city. And that meant we would need to capture data across the city and need to follow people over time as they move, and follow structures over time as the rents and prices stay. So structures as in neighborhoods and individual houses as prices change. Secondly, we realized impact will be highly different for different types of people. So specifically, initial income could likely determine the impacts, that it might be different for the poor and the rich, and that we would need to focus on, therefore, the impacts on those who move, those who don't move, those who move into the city, those who move out of the city, and so on. And maybe the two-second kind of summary of some of the things we found, we do find, as predicted, large improvements in commuting speed for people who live particularly in the areas around the infrastructure investment. But then we also find across the city changes in rents, access to amenities, and welfare, depending on who you look at. And I won't go into the details, but it is very clear that this infrastructure investment basically impacted the city overall. And the one sort of highlighting, the change that I would highlight is that we do find overall no evidence that it was anti-poor, which is a huge relief. And in fact, that welfare went up both for those who were initially rich and for those who were initially poor. And we've done a lot of work, which I'm happy to come back to. I don't want to take up more time just yet, but did a lot of work to try and really carefully track the movers, the non-movers, the rich, the poor across the city over a 5-year period. And fortunately, so far, the overall results do not make it harder for us to sleep at night, which is great.
Thank you, Bilal. Actually, we have a question from or a point from the audience from Gretchen on Kim Driggins of Washington Housing Conservancy, working on an approach to place low-income housing in high-cost land areas well connected to the labor markets. And from an economist's point of view, can you give us your reaction, exprompt reaction to the approach, moving low-income housing from cheap land to high-valued lands?
So this is, I mean, we've been thinking about this specific thing. Thank you for that question for quite a while, because one of the key approaches we were going to take in trying to understand the impact of this investment. So we've taken multiple approaches already using general equilibrium modeling and using these kind of panel surveys over time. But one thing we wanted to actually try and have been working with the government to do, and unfortunately were close to doing right when COVID hit, was actually to provide housing subsidies to individuals living close to these investments, which is at some level answering the same, or at least asking the same question that was raised, which is, what if you make housing near these investments more affordable? We were taking a slightly different approach, which is rather than building new low-income housing, which takes time and a lot of political will, we thought, okay, can we start by just simply subsidizing the rents of people who live near these investments, and in fact, providing incentives to others who may live far from these investments to actually move in closer, again, by providing essentially cash transfers or other kinds of income support to these individuals. We haven't really gotten to the point where we could do it. Again, this was planned for a year ago, exactly 1 year ago, right when things started to shut down. But my priors are, of course, that is going to have these kind of effects on prices. We can't just assume that because you're providing individuals, a subset of individuals, these options, that it won't affect kind of neighborhoods and commuting options, and similarly kind of have these spatial spillovers. But overall, my prior is that would certainly offset a lot of these effects around, potential effects around gentrification, and be welfare improving for the poor. So personally, I'm all for it. As a researcher, I can't yet tell you.
Thank you. That leads very well into your experience, Robin. Hopefully we can hear you now. So we would like to understand from you, again, you're finding in Mexico City of very differential, very extreme differences in access to social services and to labor markets for the rich and then not so rich. Can you tell us how you view the use of these data and how do we move that agenda forward?
Sure. Can you hear me now? I hope.
Wonderfully.
Wonderful. Thank you. So in addition to the data, it's actually the visualization of the data that really has made a huge difference for us in terms of the ability to establish a dialogue, not just with the government, although that's very, very important, but also with communities that are affected, right? And so that's one thing that I think this demystification and democratization of data and the stories that these data can tell sort of have really been fundamental. And there I would like to thank Sarah for really sort of leading a lot of the work in this area. So to incorporate community data, but also think about how you can combine different kinds of data in different ways. A second point is that it allows us to combine not just sort of geospatial data or crowdsourced data and some sort of what people are seeing, but also some of the kind of panel data that Bilal was talking about in terms of socioeconomic data that sort of over time will get more powerful. But right now we're sort of at the beginning. And so it's hard to be able to track the same kind of people, the same kind of populations over time. But certainly it's much easier now to talk about different scales, right? And to make problems that people live in neighborhoods more compelling to policymakers at different levels, right? People in certain neighborhoods know that when there are thunderstorms or the monsoon, depending on where they're located, there's going to be flooding. And they can go to their community, sort of their ward or their delegation or their mayor, but somehow there's often a loss of almost the seriousness of the problem when it goes to other levels. One of the things that we found with using data and then the visualization of that data is that it's much easier to tell those stories at different levels, right? So we can take those local stories and take them to the state level and take them to the national level. We can aggregate them sort of across in ways that when we were just doing it with sort of the data was much less compelling to folks than sort of the maps that can be generated. Also, it really helps generate sort of civic awareness of issues as well as sort of outrage in some cases of and it does open up more dialogues. We've done it not just in Mexico City, but in Mumbai and in Delhi and in Bangalore in India. We're starting to do it in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. We've done some of it a little bit less on the socioeconomic side, sort of with Izmir, but just again in Turkey, just using data, maps, sort of in all kinds of things together to sort of promote a dialogue and allow folks that used to be not, it allows folks that previously were not engaged to engage in ways that they can draw on their experience and participate more actively.
Great, Robin. Actually, I like, not many people will know that Sarah are actually in the Modern Art Museum. Sarah, can you tell us, I want to hear your reactions to what Robin just said, and give us a sense of what you've been able to accomplish with some of the visualizations you have done. I remember some very striking visualizations from New York, and tell us what those said to your audience.
Yeah, thanks so much, Arianna, for, I was really happy to hear Robin say that data visualizations are important. And I think the fourth chapter of my book talks a lot about how data visualizations can really have an impact on policy. I would say, like, you know, one thing that we often forget is we're always calling for open data, but, you know, many people can't actually create the insights of data. And so it's really important for us to translate those insights to broad publics. And one of the best ways to do that is through data visualizations. Not only do they help tell a story, but they're easily transferred over social media and kind of consumable, and really can get an idea out to broad groups of people quickly, rather than having to read a kind of detailed journal article. And it really helps to make those policy decisions. I think the maps that you mentioned that were in the Museum of Modern Art, let's see, we developed them like almost 15 years ago, and they are still used today, which is kind of also an incredible, you know, kind of life of a data visualization. They can have impact way beyond the project. And in that project, we looked at the cost of incarceration. We found in many blocks in New York City, over $1 million is spent to incarcerate people from those blocks, and kind of to think about the systemic reasons that that might be happening, and showing that many of those communities don't have job training programs or you know, re-entry programming for after people return to jail, and that if we just spent $1 million of those dollars, we could really have an impact on those communities. And what's interesting is, you know, this was 15 years ago, and now it's used all the time in the defund the police conversations, and it got rebooted. And so I think that's, you know, the power of visualizations for other people to acquire them and use them for their own purpose as well. They can take the insights that we gathered and then kind of use them as evidence for their own causes too. So just can't say enough about the importance of how we can communicate broad insights.
I'd like to bring the audience here, and one of the great uses, of course, of data and visualizations is to provide people with different options for commuting and walking or biking or public transport commuting. I'd like to bring back to Verena to tell us a little bit how you see the interaction between developing the technologies and the e-vehicle, you know, with information that then allows people, largest, you know, all the commuters to optimize. We have heard from Sanjay, so maybe I'll revert also back to Sanjay on this question. You know, how do we make best use of visualizations, data, and open access to information for both people and the commercial users of the road to optimize those roads?
I start before I hand over to Sanjay. I think as we just heard, I also wrote that in the chat. What we heard from Bilal, from Robin, from Sarah is the role strong communities play, and the visualization, having access to the data, making sure it's not filtered data, very important. As Sarah pointed out, not including data can also be a form of discrimination. So having data, making it accessible by visualizing it well is so important. It's a democratization, is that the right difficult word, of information. It helps if you think on a daily basis, if you think of tools that help you, and they're all data based. If you have a look how to get from one place to the other, there are now tools which give you the information what your footprint is, your environmental footprint, if you choose one mode or the other. So this is a very down to earth, real life, everyday scenario where you can see how data can really contribute to improving our improving our sustainability, and this also applies for if you look at freight transport. When you use data to optimize deliveries, if you look now outside the window, most probably wherever you live, you can see every half an hour a delivery van dropping one parcel, and then from a different company another van is coming, so not really ideal. Optimizing these processes needs data support. And of course, electric vehicles, where do they enter? Well, I think they are still vehicles. Every vehicle that has an electric engine is still a vehicle. We don't reduce the number of vehicles by that. What they can contribute is they reduce local emissions, as I said earlier. But again, data can help to understand where can we use electric vehicles best, which at the moment is mostly where it comes to short distances which need to be covered, where you have frequent stops and goes, which is obviously mostly urban areas. But just gaining these insights and being sure where to optimize the transport system in order to reduce the environmental impact, data is absolutely key. Accessible data.
Yeah, so Verena, I think that I totally agree with you in terms of the access to data, and maybe I would offer a few more thoughts around that. So the first one, for people to share data, they want to make sure, especially when there are a number of different participants and consumers, that their data is protected and they have full control and access and an ability to monetize data as well, when there are multiple actors involved. So having a framework that supports that is critical, because that allows people and encourages people to come in, share with each other. The second aspect is, and now we go into a very sophisticated usage of AI and data analytics tools, not for the end user, but using that intelligence to make sure data is brought in to an end user, be it a consumer or a business user, that also captures the context of the user. So depending on what service that they're doing or what experience that they're going through. So having the intelligence to come up with context-specific sharing and our visualization of data is important. And the last one, it comes down to accessibility, because, and Verena touched on the whole democratization of how you even visualize data. And this is where technology has evolved quite a bit. In the past, you used to have a very tech-intense user to start creating right experiences and the user interfaces for people. And today we are getting into a place where a lot of the folks who don't have deep IT technology backgrounds can start configuring and offering up those different ways of very context-specific visualization to the end user. So that plays a role in simplifying the environment, so more people have access to data, but also can use this data to support their business processes and experiences.
So some of the issues that you have mentioned refers to whether the underlying data is actually biased, whether the underlying data is a true reflection of the communities and cities and countries we live in, or whether it's a selected sample. And then by using those data, we might actually draw wrong conclusions about what we should be doing next, exactly because of the exclusion of populations that might be the very target of our efforts. And in that, I always felt that the interaction between people, technology, and data people with researchers who can really dig into whether or not the data is usable in its form, or what can it be used for, or how do we create data that is more representative of the whole population is a very important issue. Question to Sarah, but really a question to all of you. Sarah, because she's been working with us on the Nairobi project, where there is a definite difference between administrative data on crashes and the data that we draw from Twitter, and we show that, social media data increases the number of reports of crashes quite dramatically. It is not universal either. And so is the administrative data. And by being very resourceful, perhaps we can start getting a real picture of and developing better data by integrating and being very resourceful from the research side on how to create more inclusive data sets. Sarah, what is your reaction to that?
This is a really good question. So it gets back to what I was talking about, is like these missing data. And, here in our project, we really were able to show that we can, the government consistently underreports the amount of traffic accidents, maybe on purpose. Let's not get into that. But the social media data really is one way to get that data when other data doesn't exist. And that's something that we've used a lot in my research. I also think it brings up a more important point, is that, when we talk about missing data in the African continent and Latin American continent, sometimes that data actually exists in the hands of Facebook, in the hands of Google, and others. And I really think that we need to be working more to creating partnerships where that data is used for a public good, and encouraging relationships with companies who have so much data that could really benefit these societies, but doing it in an ethical and responsible way. And I think, related to this point, it's really interesting. Obama's new advisor on data, has been trying to make these relationships. Sorry, not Obama, Biden's. Biden's new advisor.
Confused.
Yes, you were all confused. Biden, I'm like thinking Obama, Biden. Biden's new advisor for data has been trying to make a lot of these relationships with private companies to try to do this work. I've worked with Facebook's Data for Good team, and they do have, incredible amounts of data that could be used I used it in Nairobi, but in a lot of the contexts that we work in, but they don't know how to share it yet. And I think we need to be doing that work, or at least I'm interested in doing that work, to try to encourage these relationships more ethically and responsibly. I mean, they could even think of it as a data philanthropy. And if we could create some incentives along those lines, I think it would be really important. I think also it's important for governments to encourage this, because in a way, by Facebook and Google having more data than the government has, in a sense, they become, let's say, more powerful than the governments in itself. So I think also governments need to be thinking about, talking with these companies and saying, you need to work more collaboratively with us.
Yeah, I was wondering if any of you like to comment on this idea of scaling up, right? So Sarah mentioned, data for environments. We certainly face that, not because, as she said, necessarily there's no data, but there is no capacity to leverage, integrate, make use of the data that is existing, and then building on that, which is one of our large focuses, really to understand how we develop these pilots to build data in an environment where there is none, and then learn how to do it and scaling up to other environments. Any reactions on that? I know, Robin, you had a point, and I don't know if you want to talk to that too.
Yeah, sort of following up and then getting to your point, sort of is just the data governance issues are so important. And that's issues of privacy and anonymity in ownership and security and access and comprehensiveness and interoperability, so that we are able sort of to work with different communities and different groups. And that's where I think this idea of sort of data as a public good actually can be quite powerful and very important. In the work that we do with different cities and with private sector entities in different places, we often find a real nervousness about sharing the data because there is so much uncertainty about how it's going to be used and who's going to benefit. And that's, I think, one of the big points of negotiation that needs to happen with some of these platforms and the private sector is, who is going to benefit, and if somebody is going to monetize it, to make sure that people don't feel that they're being sort of, that their resource is being monetized for somebody else's gain. I think Onkar wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. So, what you said touched upon many things. Data monetization, data governance. These are big aspects, particularly when it comes to transport sustainability, right? And in that regard, also, Verena spoke on the electrification or carbon neutrality. So all these things are coming together in terms of sustainability. And the way I see it has 4 or more than 4 legs, I would say. The carbon neutrality, ease of access, the cost of transportation, and the COVID implications, the data ownership, data governance, how they are interlinked. Then when it comes to maturity level, from data platform to visualization to descriptive ML AI, then to prescriptive side of things, right? These are multiple facets where you have to bring lots of insights, and on top of it, missing data or biased data. So we really have to, in terms of sustainable transportation, we have to have a holistic point of view in terms of as a city, but also as a company or a user, because a user is inherently giving his or her data within the city environment to Facebook or to whatever, or to government itself. So that holistic nature we have to look into and work upon to make the transportation, in my opinion, sustainable.
No, if I may. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
And then Paul.
Yeah, I think one of the other aspects, Arianna, you mentioned, was also the skilling required here, because there's tools and capabilities on the other side. But one of the research numbers from the World Economic Forum, they're predicting 77% of the jobs over the next 10 years will be in technology, and you do need people who have these tech capabilities and skill sets to use data and also contribute. So this is an area where we are investing quite a bit from Microsoft around our own global skilling initiative, teaming up with people like with LinkedIn and GitHub, and we're able to provide free training in the top 10 in-demand digital jobs to almost 25 million people. And we believe that's really important to upskill and drive that. Also, the Microsoft AI for Accessibility and the new Microsoft Enabler program. These are all programs to serve and improve the employability of people with disabilities, in this case, focused in Southeast Asia. Also applicable to the earlier conversation we had in terms of supporting some of the underprivileged populations. We are also partnering with an example with Grab in Singapore to provide free access to Microsoft training via Grab Academy for driver and delivery partners. This will benefit about 5,000 Grab partners by end of 2021. And it's also supporting players like Grab with their own social impact goals to bring digital literacy and greater inclusion to almost 3 million Southeast Asians. So again, number of different programs that we believe are really, really important to upskill and support people with the needed technology capabilities to use data and also contribute in this emerging space.
I love that. And it kind of brings it back to Bilal's point, in a way, how we can transform the world and connect and link it to jobs if people have the right skills to connect and actually provide their services no matter where they're sitting. Working from Nairobi in a global company based out of Seattle. This is really, really exciting, kind of changing and challenging our options of mobility across the world, the linking and creating opportunities in developing countries for people with the right skills. But as you say, Sanjay, we do need to invest, and countries do need to invest inordinately into people's technical skills and ability to be included in the global economy. You know, the number of underfilled position, working, for example, in Brazil, hundreds of thousands of empty jobs for programmers. This is, you know, kind of the demand and supply for coding jobs has a huge gap in most of developing countries. So really a big plug in for those skills. This is not specifically a transport issue, but it certainly affects all of the industry, including the transportation sector. Bilal, do you have any thoughts on that? And I know, Paul, you're waiting for a comment as well.
No, I completely agree with you. I think this is so much about leaving money on the table. And it's also interesting, I mean, coming purely from, so I'm sitting in San Francisco right now. And one of the really interesting things is that this city has completely transformed over the last year, because all the tech firms have suddenly realized that they're paying huge amounts of money for extremely expensive amounts of office space that their workers don't really want to work in. And everyone else has moved to Tahoe or started to look for second homes. And so what's basically happening here is that, you know, a number of tech firms have said, okay, you know, this work from home is now going to be a permanent outcome. Now, what that's going to do, hopefully, and as we've already started to see, is that suddenly large amounts of high value property are being freed up as a number of firms kind of scale back their office space. That's going to have an impact on rents across the city. And this makes so much more sense. And as these kinds of options become more and more available, I feel that on the simple kind of skill matching front, there are just going to be the future of work has kind of already arrived for a certain subset of occupations, and others I think are going to slowly catch up over time. I guess I just make kind of a we are out of time. I want to leave the last 20 seconds to Paul, and then we'll close the session.
I just wanted to reiterate the point that Sarah and Robin made about data accessibility for communities and governments. I think it's so important. We can't underestimate the importance of investing in infrastructure, investing in the local communities, and that's something, you know, that investment in technology infrastructure can bring, as opposed to relying on big tech companies that are producing products that will hold on to that data themselves. So, you know, we really want to focus on empowering communities and jurisdictions and governments to collect and get their own data to retain control over that information.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, all of you. This was an extraordinarily exciting session. I've learned a lot. We are set to continue working really hard on data visualizations, research, to provide a completely different environment for decision-making, especially in developing countries, making hard choices on the use of resources, on where to invest, where to place their infrastructure, how to change their own environments of skills and technology use. So thank you very much, all of you, Robin, Sarah, Sanjay, Paul, Bilal, Onkar, Verena. This was a pleasure to be with you during this hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you as well.
Arianna.